Sonic had a rough transition to 3D, is a sentiment shared pretty vastly throughout the gaming landscape. As time progressed, however, that phrase has died down quite significantly, with the favor even turning towards Sonic having a not-so-bad transition into 3D. This was the opinion I myself also held, with me somewhat recently making an entire video dedicated to whether or not Sonic had a rough transition into 3D, and I came to the conclusion that no, not really, he didn't. However, a lot has changed since then and now, and my opinion on the matter has changed a surprising amount actually. You see, for the past couple of months, I've been trying to more closely analyze Sonic games, or really, games as a whole, to study more game design. And after countless hours spent in both the classics and adventure titles, a really striking realization hit me. Sonic Adventure is a bad translation of the classics. Now, when talking about 3D translations of 2D games, I think it's important to look at the gaming landscape around that time, and one thing that I will give SA1 right off the bat is that things could have been a lot worse. There were plenty of 3D translations that missed the mark heavily and were outright awful. However, at the same time, things could have been a lot better. I find that Sonic Adventure, while bringing the series into a new era, managed to water down some of the most important fundamentals of the classics. Now, while Adventure isn't fully to blame for this, I believe this game was the beginning of what led to Sonic's continuous gameplay identity crisis that's still felt to this day. You ask a Mario fan what games they like, they're gonna name basically every Mario game they've played. You ask a Sonic fan what games they like, things get a bit more varied. Some prefer the classics, some like the Boost era, some like the Adventure era, some like certain eras while not liking others. Generally speaking, if a Mario fan likes Mario 3, they like New Super Mario Bros. And if they like that, they usually like Odyssey. But I'm deviating a bit. How is Sonic Adventure a bad translation of the classics? Well, there's a lot of reasons why, but I think I'll start off with one of the most important ones, the lessened importance of slope physics. Now, before I continue, I'll be quick. If you enjoy, I'd be grateful if you could subscribe to the channel, as it helps me out a ton. If you want to go the extra mile, becoming a patron is the best way to support me directly, and you'll also get early access to videos for only $2. But anyways, let's get back to it. Slope physics were at the helm of classic Sonic gameplay, as I'm sure you're all aware. This one fundamental of those games nearly dictates how a lot of levels are played. There's so many variables to your movement because of the existence of slope physics, and it changes how the game is played on a moment-to-moment basis, leading to thoughtful gameplay, where you must be not aware of only Sonic himself, but the ground he runs on. Now, something that might have raised an eyebrow if you've watched me for a while is that I've spoken multiple times about loving stages that have little to no slope interactions at all. For example, Marble Zone. Now, while I do find the most interesting levels of Sonic to be those that focus on slope physics and what have you, Marble Zone gets an excuse that Sonic Adventure doesn't. Marble Zone actually has fun and challenging platforming that keeps things interesting. Rarely does Sonic Adventure ever actually challenge the player in any meaningful way in their platforming skills with interesting level design. So while slope physics aren't the sole dictator of my enjoyment of stages, they do play a big part in it. It also helps that Marble Zone is an exception, not a regular thing, whereas Sonic Adventure does next to nothing with its slope physics all the time. You see, SA1 does have slope physics. It's very easy to see that when rolling down hills. However, its use in levels is almost non-existent, and when they do make their way into the level in an integral way, their usage is always very binary. The classics held so much nuance with the way it utilized slope physics. However, in Sonic Adventure, very rarely do they ever alter the way you play the game or approach certain levels. Slope physics in Adventure are a thing that exists, but they don't matter. Sometimes you're given points to roll down a long hill, and that's it. Usually the speed you gain from rolling downhill matters very little anyways, given that the hill will usually end in an automated set piece that sets your speed to an arbitrary number. Not to mention with all this that rolling down hills and gaining speed via environmental interactions matter very little anyways, given that the spin dash has removed any need to properly engage with the levels. The spin dash is its own can of worms. The spin dash in the classics worked very simply. Crouch, spam jump to rev a spin dash, and then release it to give yourself a burst of speed to help you out if you're very low on it. It was something that was a very helpful tool, however skilled players wouldn't need to rely on it given that they'd have to come to a stop losing all of their presumably high amounts of speed. It was something that helped out lower skilled players while still helping out everyone if they ended up losing a bunch of speed. There wasn't an over-reliance on it. In Sonic Adventure, the spin dash loses any real intent it had in the classics, becoming something more akin to the boost seen in future titles. I'm okay with the change made where you don't have to crouch first to rev it. Not like there's a crouch button in the first place, there's no way to simply roll as Sonic, but it's the way that the move works that I take issue with. I'm sure you all know of it, but the spam dash is a prominent thing to perform for any skilled player due to how broken it is and how easy it is to perform. All you do is just spam the spin dash button, and after a few spin dashes, Sonic will be at max speed. This spits in the face of any nuance the spin dash had in the classics. Now, there is an over-reliance on it. Even if slope physics were important to this game, what would it matter? There's a tech that negates any reason to ever try to gain momentum properly. Any skilled player can use it, and it's the most optimal way to gain speed, which is horrible game design. It invalidates any meaningful interactions you could have with your environment aside from slope jumping. Overall, the spin dash is a horrible inclusion for this game, and makes the majority of the game absolutely brain dead. I will say the singular saving grace the spin dash has is the spin dash jump, which is also sort of a double-edged sword. Since you gain a ton of speed when spin dashing, jumping right after one will let you soar a good distance. This is both a good and bad thing, as it yet again gives you a means to not interact with the actual level, but on the other hand, it's unfortunately the only way to get any sort of real platforming out of the game. Because of automation and homing chains, things I will touch on soon, a good way to avoid these things is by doing actual platforming via slope jumping. The best example can be seen in Red Mountain, where instead of using this homing chain, you can simply jump across to save time. Nothing crazy by any means, but I'm at least participating in the game. I do think it speaks wonders of this game's quality as a platformer, when some of the most fun you can get out of it is using an exploit to make basic jumps, when in any other game this would be nothing special at all. However, I did mention the homing attack and automation earlier, so let's talk about that. I'm not going to harp on the homing attack too much, as I've already made a full video on the topic alone. However, it'd be impossible to not mention the start of everyone's favorite thing, the homing attack. The homing attack is the means of hitting an enemy in a 3D space, and it is really bad. So to get out of the way, I'm not opposed to the idea of the homing attack. With someone as fast as Sonic, it's important that you're able to easily hit enemies, so something that assists you with that doesn't really bother me. However, the execution of it is horrid. The inclusion of the homing attack is directly supposed to be a means of badnik bouncing in a 3D space. However, it becomes very easy to see how this was not a job well done when comparing how the homing attack works in Adventure and comparing it to the classics. The badnik bounce in the classics had actual nuance. Normally, you just jump on an enemy and do a little bounce off of him. Pretty neat. However, depending on the max height you had before landing on the badnik, you'd bounce back up to that height, leading to some really interesting player expression and speedrun strats. Suddenly, every badnik now becomes an opportunity to regain height and maintain speed. In Sonic Adventure, the badnik bounce has been reduced to nothing but a fully binary, boring move. It's a means of destroying enemies and nothing more. There are no opportunities, no nothing. The way enemies are placed in the levels aren't even the same way they're used in the classics. Enemies were something that were scattered throughout the levels and served as an easy to overcome obstacle, with the constant opportunity of badnik bouncing at your disposal. In Adventure, they are used exclusively for homing chains and to do the platforming for you. They now have a single use, and not only that, they carry zero properties the badnik bounce had, except for the technical definition of, yeah, you are bouncing on a badnik. Now, I want to put it out there that simply deviating from how the classics did something isn't a proper reason for me to dislike it. I am perfectly fine with the classic formula evolving in some way to make for some more interesting gameplay. However, every change made in Sonic Adventure are exclusively downgrades that serve to make gameplay less interesting. I am not against change by itself. I'm against change when all it does is strip down interesting parts of the gameplay to make for an overall worse experience, and that's what Sonic Adventure does. None of these changes add to the experience. The less than important slope physics, all it does is make things less interesting. So does the homing attack, so does the spam dash, so does everything. Mario 64, although it's not a perfect translation by any means, is a way better one than Sonic Adventure despite arguably changing more. There's no run button, levels are no longer linear, the physics are overall pretty different. However, there's something about this that makes it okay. You see, Mario is the most basic of a platformer you can get. You have a run and a jump, and while things like the jump do carry nuance, it carries way less than Sonic's jump. Now, with a gameplay style as simple as Mario's, he lends himself very well to different playstyles and philosophies. The core of Mario has always been much simpler than the core of Sonic's, with Mario's being simply running and jumping through thoughtfully designed platforming stages. That's why, despite being very different from the original Mario Bros., it still feels like a Mario game through and through. Sonic, on the other hand, has way more to his core gameplay identity. You've got the run and jump, each having tons of nuance, with the jump having different properties depending on what slope you're on, the speed you're going, the angle of it, etc. You also have the fact that Sonic shares a lot of DNA with pinball, he himself having physics that closely resemble one, which gives us the important usage of slopes and what have you. Overall, Sonic has a lot more fundamental traits than Mario, which means it's way easier to poorly translate them. Mario is an easier character to do different things with, as it's very hard to lose the very core of Mario. With Sonic, it's very easy to lose a lot of the fundamentals that define those classic games, and that's why I take issue with Sonic Adventure. The more you change Sonic, the less recognizable his gameplay style becomes. Now, the final thing I feel the need to talk about is the usage of automation and the level design as a whole. Sonic Adventure has a big problem of automating things that were done manually, even if easy, differently from the classics. The homing attack is a good indicator of this, but it goes a little bit farther. Loops, despite arguably being automated to a certain extent in the classics, still serve the purpose, even if a small one, outside of spectacle. For most games, they act as a simple speed check, with passing them granting you even more speed than you went in with. The game tended to test you when they gave you speed. It was a way of them saying, here's some free speed, but let's see if you can actually maintain it. In Sonic Adventure, there is nothing to do with the speed that's given to you via a loop. And most of the time, they just shoot you up into the sky, leaving you to just fall back down at a speed that's not even very fast. The speed check aspect is gone, as now no matter the speed you approach them with, you'll be automatically set to a high enough speed to pass through. Loops weren't the only thing affected though, as springs were stripped of the interesting properties they had as well. In the classics, they preserved all of your forward momentum, which to dumb it down, made it so they could act as a pseudo-badnik bounce. Springs had variables to them. Depending on how you approached one, it could change how you play the following section, and by extension, the rest of the level. In Sonic Adventure, they are purely automated and serve exclusively to get you from place to place. Nothing interesting whatsoever. Speaking of nothing interesting, the level design as a whole. The level design of Sonic Adventure, for the most part, is very boring and uninteresting. The majority of the game follows this huge hold forward to win mentality. And while Sonic is no stranger to this sort of mindset, other games with this mentality usually have a purpose to it, by having higher level play and a skill ceiling that separates people who hold forward from the people who try. Adventure suffers because, well, a lot of the time it's simply the most optimal to just hold forward and spam dash. Emerald Coast and Windy Valley, despite their iconic status, are absolute bores when I go back to replay them because there's nothing going on. Aside from the very small unintended shortcuts in Emerald Coast, it has nothing going for it. And when the game decides to switch things up and attempt some more platforming, most of the time it just doesn't feel special because all platforming is handled the exact same way, with spin dash jumps in place to erase any possible ways that you could interact with the platforming challenge in any way that's interesting. As a Sonic game, it doesn't do anything interesting, and as a platformer, this thing doesn't hold a candle to even some of the most simple platformers out there. I saw one tweet that sort of resonated with me a while ago that said something like, bring most Sonic games into the discussion of platformers and see how far you get. And that's very true. Sonic Adventure isn't a very good platformer, and it also does very little to scratch the itch of what I want out of a Sonic game. All in all, while I do hold some respect for Sonic Adventure and do appreciate certain aspects of it, like the music and visuals, from purely a gameplay perspective, I think this game lacks severely, and I think a big reason why is because it's a poor translation of the classics. I know the technology wasn't fully capable of replicating classic Sonic physics, so you could argue that it's disingenuous to compare them, but at the same time, I don't know, I feel like it's warranted given that this set the blueprint for the future of Sonic and the fact that to this day, they've never tried going back to the classic philosophies by pushing past the limits of the adventure era. But anyways, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, be sure to subscribe, and if you want to go the extra mile, join my Patreon for early access to videos. I'll see you all next time. Peace.